former personal attorney previously to Donald Trump. Jim Trusty is here. And Jim, what do you make of what Ellie just brought up there? I mean, you obviously represented Trump previously, but you also ran the Justice Department's organized crime section at one point. Do you think having multiple people who previously represented Trump at the top layers of the Justice Department is an issue?
Not particularly. I mean, look, there's a couple of things. The Attorney General position, which I view as a very, very important position for the country, you know, from being around criminal justice for 35 years, for being at the department for 17, you know, I view it as a critically important job where there were great need for independence and competence. But historically, you had a president that picked his brother. More recently, you had a president whose AG said, I'm his wingman. So this idea that they're going to be thoroughly, perfectly independent is always a little bit of a myth. You do want a strong personality, somebody that will stand up for what's right. I'll tell you, my criteria, though, drifts from where you guys are. What I would say is, number one, the president clearly wants somebody who's willing to throw a grenade under the tent. You know, somebody who's going to blow up the politicized culture. And I'll tell you, I think that's right. I think they need someone who's going to go in and say, let me hear about all the misconduct that was affiliated with the Trump investigation and others to find out if heads should roll. But beyond that, every morning, and Ellie knows this too, every morning, like 7:30, the Attorney General gets a briefing where they're being asked questions about, what do we do on this terrorism case? Do we have enough to pull the trigger? Or what about this counter-espionage? Or what about this senator? And those are really nuanced, difficult questions of procedure and judgment. And I like the thought of someone with some prosecutorial experience. And Bondi may not have had that level, that exact altitude, but I think she's pretty well equipped to do the daily job that's so important, and that's frankly much more important than kind of bald notions of political allegiance.
So you do think Pam Bondi is a good choice for this role?
Look, I think, you know, for me, and maybe it's a function of me being old, you know, I value experience. I like people that have some inside experience. I know you don't want somebody from the swamp to manage the swamp, but I like the fact that she's got serious prosecutorial experience. She's obviously a political figure and a media figure, too. But, you know, 20 years in a large state handling an office with significant cases and being in the trenches trying cases, those are good signs from my perspective.
Can whoever Trump puts in at the DOJ, I mean, it's very clear, as you just pointed there, about someone who would go in and throw a grenade into the department. Can you do that, though, and do the actual work of the Justice Department, which is maintaining that layer of independence that has existed, but also you're managing 93 U.S. attorneys, the FBI, the DEA, ATF. It's a lot of employees. Can you do, I mean, I think that's the question of what Trump wants and what the DOJ requires in a leader.
Yeah, look, it's a tough balance. I think typically the Deputy Attorney General is the guy that's really, or gal, that's more involved in steering this giant aircraft carrier full of personnel. And generally, when you're moving a giant ship, it only moves a little bit at a time. And obviously, you have AAGs, you know, the people that run things like the criminal division, civil division, that also have important managerial roles on kind of the day-to-day operations and the judgment calls. But again, the Attorney General himself or herself is going to be asked to make some really difficult calls, maybe ones we don't hear about for years. And I think that, thankfully, I suspect that her temperament and her experience can serve her well in that position.
Todd Blanche, John Sauer, Emil Bove, Will Scharf, and now Pam Bondi, all people who have represented Trump in some form that are going in. You also represented him. Would you take a job in the administration? You waiting by the phone?
I'm not waiting by the phone. I don't know what's left, dog catcher? I mean, maybe. I'll give it some thought. But look, I'm happy doing what I'm doing. You know, I enjoy doing what I'm doing. I enjoy having a good relationship with a former client. You know, we still get along, and I still am very happy for him in terms of persevering the lawfare that offended me and that caused me to even testify in front of Congress about it. So, you know, I think changing DOJ is something that is conceivable. It is something where the culture can be changed, and it might take a lot of time and a lot of fighting, but it's worth pursuing.
Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Ellie Honig. Ellie, Pam Bondi is not a household name for everyone. Obviously, those of us in Trump world know her very well. When you look at her qualifications, how does she compare to previous picks for Attorney General?
Well, Caitlin, she's way more qualified than Matt Gaetz. Let's start with that. You know, last week when Matt Gaetz was announced as Trump's original pick, you and I said there's two main things you have to look at: qualification and independence. So on the first of those qualifications, Pam Bondi is, without a question, qualified to be Attorney General. She's been a prosecutor for 20 years in Florida. For 8 of those, she was the Attorney General of the state. That's a very big, very complicated job. And that level of experience is on par with or better than most United States attorneys general that we've seen over the past 50 years or so. When we get into independence, though, things get a little more complicated. Now, there's nothing wrong or unusual with an attorney general who shares the same politics and ideology as the president. That's the way these things work. But I think the big problem with Pam Bondi is she was a vocal 2020 election denier. And I think that raises legitimate questions about her independence and her credibility. And I expect that to be a sticking point when she goes in front of the Senate.
But I guess the question is, has the curve changed? Like, I mean, we all know when we were in school, you got graded on a curve in some cases, and it would help you a lot with what ultimately how you scored. I mean, could that be a dynamic here, given maybe 4 years ago or 8 years ago, she would not have been a conventional choice for Attorney General, but in the dynamic of who is being put up for the cabinet now, I think that's a question of whether that changes this.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. I think if we compare her to Matt Gaetz, she exceeds him on every level by far. But if we go back to sort of a normal curve, I think it's a closer call. One person who I think is an interesting historical comparison for Pam Bondi is Janet Reno. Now, I'm not saying Pam Bondi will be Janet Reno, but Janet Reno had a similar background. She had been a state-level prosecutor in Florida for about 15 years at the time when Bill Clinton nominated her to become Attorney General. Now, I think the difference, though, is Janet Reno was probably the single most independent Attorney General we've had in this country for at least the last 75 years and maybe beyond that, often to the consternation of the Clinton administration. I think every indication is that Pam Bondi will not be anywhere near that independent, if she'll be independent at all. But again, this is a Republican administration. Donald Trump won the election. We're not going to have an Attorney General, Eric Holder or Sally Yates or Pete Buttigieg or Elizabeth Warren. This is elections have consequences.
Well, what does that look like, though? Because that has been the norm for the White House ever since the Nixon era of this independence between the Justice Department and the White House. I mean, last I checked, President Biden and Attorney General Merrick Garland had not spoken in quite some time. He was actually quite frustrated with him. But that independence layer is there, obviously, for a reason, based on past historical precedents. We'll see what that looks like. I do want to mention, though, because you talk about her what this looks like. You mentioned her role in filing those election-related lawsuits in 2020. She also previously has been a registered lobbyist for Qatar. There was the time when she faced the scrutiny over the $25,000, the campaign contribution she got from Trump at the same time her office was considering signing on to other litigation investigations into Trump University. Are those questions that you would expect to come up at her confirmation hearing?
Oh, absolutely. That is all fair game. If you're going to go put yourself up for Attorney General, you have to assume everything you've done is going to be fair game for questioning. And I think that latter thing that you mentioned, Caitlin, is going to be a big deal. What happened was Donald Trump's charitable foundation made a $25,000 donation to Pam Bondi's super PAC. At the time, Pam Bondi, which is Attorney General of Florida, was considering joining a lawsuit against Donald Trump for his university, quote unquote university. Now, ultimately, the state of New York brought that lawsuit, but Pam Bondi decided not to bring it. And when that transaction came under scrutiny, originally the party said, whoops, it was a mistake. We actually didn't mean to donate it to Pam Bondi. We meant to give it to some other entity, some other nonprofit in Kansas. Ultimately, though, that was disproven. That was proven to not be the case. That got them into some trouble with the IRS. They had to give the donation back. So that's exactly the kind of thing that I think is fair play here. And Caitlin, it's important to know, we are now looking at a possible situation where the top 4 officials at the Justice Department, and that could be Pam Bondi, could be Todd Blanche, who's nominated for Deputy AG, could be John Sauer, who's up for Solicitor General, and it could be Emil Bove, have all represented Donald Trump in some personal capacity. And it's important to know it's a very different job than being AG. When you're the personal lawyer or criminal lawyer for anybody, your interests align 100% with that person. When you're the Attorney General, though, you're not supposed to have the same orientation. There are times when a good Attorney General, like Janet Reno, has to do things that are adverse to a president and has to exercise independence. So I think that'll be the overarching question.